me share my screen over here. I hope everyone can see it correctly. All right, I see a thumbs up. Awesome. So yeah, I have some thoughts there, and actually four topics that I want to address in this time slot of more or less 40-45 minutes. It is an estimate, I must admit, because I collected some slides from various presentations to fit the description. So fingers crossed, I hope my estimate turns out more or less okay. And we begin with the business life cycle. And actually, this picture, an old family picture of me, my parents, my younger brother, and my younger sister. Am I not looking cute here? Don't you think, people? This was, I think I was about 9 or something. Look at the sexy pants that I was wearing. Everyone has these nowadays. I was the first one in the world, I think, with with sexy pants like these. But I share this picture because of a nice story that I remember. My younger brother, Jurgen, he was at the time 6 or more or less, I think. He complained to my mother that I was allowed to come home anytime I wanted, and he had to be home at 6. And that was not fair, he said. It was very unfair that I had different rules. I was allowed to come home whenever I wanted, and he was not. Well, my mother was a wise woman. Of course, she said to him, well, he's in a different life cycle stage, your older brother. So maybe when you are 3 years older, you get the same rules. But of course, it depends whether or not I still have to pick you up from the police station, yes or not. My little brother, he was such a rascal. He is okay now, by the way, but oh my God, we have such wonderful stories about him. Anyways, he had to earn the right to also be allowed to come home anytime he wanted. I use this example as a metaphor of the life cycle stages of not only human beings, but also of businesses. And I like this metaphor as well of biology. For me, a product is like an organism. It starts up, it grows, it scales up, and at some point it dies. And we need to see the organization like a species. If it wants to live for a very, very, very long time, it needs to exist of products that are starting up, scaling up, and screwing up at some point. And then the economy is like the biosphere, where all these organizations, species work together, collaborate, and compete at the same time. Now, I found 10 stages of the human life cycle that I will not go into in specifics here, but I'm sure everyone agrees with me that you can come up with some kind of model of life cycle stages. We agree that there are teenage years. We agree that there are baby years, etc., etc. Now, let's see how that works for products and business models. I think usually starts with an idea, like the under the shower moment. 1,000 songs in your pocket is something that Steve Jobs came up with. He thought, I need to compete with all the other MP3 players out there and come up with a much better one. That was 20 years ago. And that saved Apple as a company, basically. And then the next stage is figuring out if that idea of yours is making sense, if there is problem solution fit, as they call this in startup language. Without actually building the product, you should verify, validate that people are interested in this. Actually, the Kickstarter website, for example, is full of products in problem solution fit stage. Most of them don't even exist. They're just mock-ups, 3D renderings of potential products, and then they test whether people sign up to the actual creation of those products. And then stage 3 is forming a team, getting a budget maybe from the executives, from an innovation committee, or if you're an independent startup, you will need angel investors, someone who puts money in it so that you can actually build the product, which would be stage 4. Now you go to product market fit. That's a very famous term in the startup scene. Can you now make a product that really works for customers, that they love using, with high retention, low churn, etc.? Minimal viable products is a very a common term of lean startup language. I'm sure some of you know what I'm talking about. And then once you've created something that actually works, are you then ready to scale up? No. In my travels around Europe, I talked with many startup founders and investors, etc. I read a bunch of stuff, and I noticed that many startups many startups die in the scaling years because they have not properly prepared. And I see it as a separate stage, stabilizing things. After a successful product, you should prepare for scaling up. You're not ready yet to play among the big people, you could say. If you did things well, lean startup style, you focused only on the front end facing, part, the customer facing part of your product. And in the back end, everything is a mess, probably. Like in my startup, everything is a mess. Nobody sees it, but in the back end, it's a disaster. That needs to be fixed before you scale things up, of course. Then stage 6 is scaling up. That's the acceleration years. The teenage years, that would be the analogy here. And by the way, the pictures that you see here are of my mother growing up. I asked her 2 years ago, can you come up with, do you have photos of 10 life cycle stages? And as she went through the photo album, she was very proud to be in my presentations ever since. So you can see from the look in her eyes as a teenager that she discovered new possibilities as a human being. Everything changes when you are a teenager, right? We all remember that, I'm pretty sure. And then stage 7, you're a young adult, you've cornered the market. From this point, the business model needs to be profitable. The startup needs to be profitable. Your product needs to make money. The previous stages, you can still get away with losing money if you have investors willing to fund development and scaling. But by this point, they want to see a return on investment. They want to see dividends. They want to see something coming out of it. So Tesla and Spotify, since a year or so, are now in stage 7. They have broken even and now profitable. Stage 8 is midlife crisis, I always say, trying to stay relevant in a market that's changing with product variants, new territories. When the iPod appeared in 16 different colors, you could say, well, that was midlife crisis. They ran out of ideas. Let's produce the same thing in all the colors of the rainbow. And then stage 9 is conservation. All goals are achieved. Everything is in decline, basically. And stage 10 is done. It's the end of the business life cycle. You make it a project to offboard customers, move them elsewhere, and the service is stopped. Basically, no customer support anymore. You see this life cycle here for the iPod. It played out between 2000 and 2014, more or less. In 2008, they had the highest revenues. At some point, it was 40% of Apple's income, and then it was in decline, midlife crisis, and at some point, it was dead, over. This is normal. This is normal for almost any kind of product out there, any business model. As I say, it starts up, scales up, and at some point, it screws up. It's inevitable. You just want the screw up to be as late as possible, but it will be there. All species die out as well at some point. Now, I've done quite a few workshops before COVID-19 hit the world, and then I asked people to come up with typical behaviors, not only of human beings at the bottom end of this wall, but also typical behaviors of teams and their contributions to products. And things change over time. As with the rules for me and my brother, they changed. My parents did not treat us the same. And that's also my message to organizations, that you should not treat everyone the same in the organization. It depends on what product, what business model they are working on. Let me give you a very concrete example. Objectives and key results, OKRs, are all the rage nowadays. everyone in the Agile community is at least talking about it, and many people trying them out. It's a great a goal-setting framework. The only problem is it's a bit complicated to get it to work. People say it could take a year or so to get used to that cadence of bottom-up, top-down goal setting. In the startup world, they don't really talk about OKRs. They talk about the North Star metric. It's much simpler. It is a very simple paradigm. The single metric that captures core value for your customers. It offers a team laser focus, a product team, on what to optimize. Preferably, this should be something that is a proxy for the value that your customers get out of the product. For example, with Spotify, that would be the number of songs or the minutes of music per month or per week that a user on average listens to Spotify. That's a reasonable proxy for the value that they get out of it. Now, the idea here is that this works for startup teams. It doesn't really scale. I mean, you cannot have 30,000 people all try to orient themselves towards one North Star metric. That's not going to work. So it doesn't really scale. And I think, therefore, that this works fine in the early stages for the young ones, the kids among the business models and the products. But at some point, when they grow up, they might want the more complicated version, which would be objectives and key results. Why would we roll out one framework in the whole company? It should depend on what each business unit is doing. Some of them are mostly in exploration stage. Some of them are mostly in execution. And we need to be respectful of what they're doing. In the early years, you're trying to do the right thing. And then slowly but steadily, you're trying to do that thing right. The kids do the exploring, the adults do the execution. Both of them are very important responsibilities in the whole family that we call the company. I'm not the only one who came up with this. Kent Beck has his 3X model, and he's one of the signatories of the Agile Manifesto. He has a simpler version, you could say, that he calls explore, expand, extract. And that's the summary. I have the more fine-grained model, but we mean the same thing. And he said, for example, that in the early years, test-driven development makes no sense. That is what he found out at Facebook, where they just had to move fast and break things. It makes sense to do TDD once you know what the product is actually supposed to do. So at the point you start to grow up, from the teenage years, that is a perfect moment to start introducing TDD, because then you know what you're actually building. Before that, you're just trying stuff out and probably throwing 90% away because it doesn't work. Why would you TDD all of that? He said. So the main risk is building something that nobody wants to use. The main risk is not that it is of low quality. That's a later concern. So that's the first part of my bigger message. Now we'll get back to this at the end. That practices need to depend on where products are in the entire life cycle of a business. Do not treat the kids the same as the adults. Do not treat them the same as the grandparents. They have different responsibilities in the whole family, and the company should be the whole family if it wants to survive for a long time. And some families have been around for a very, very long time on this planet. They just have to keep making babies. So next topic, as part of those early years, but also for the adults that also still have a bit of exploration going on, because that never really stops, we need to understand how that works. And to be honest, I see too often that people talk about failure, celebrating failure, embracing failure, etc., etc. Personally, I am becoming a little bit allergic, you could maybe say, of this terminology. I think we need something different. Now, maybe some of you recognize this diagram, the celebration grid. A few people have said to me that this is the best diagram that I've ever made. I'm not sure if they are right, but I think it's okay. It has 3 columns, and on one side we find the good practices, on the other side we find the stupid mistakes, and then in the middle the experiments. And the point of this model is showing you that with experiments we learn the most. You see that at the bottom, the information density is highest according to math, basically, and information theories. Well, when there's a 50-50 chance of succeeding or failing with your experiment, then you learn the most. Now, what the adults do is mostly good practices, of course. That's the whole point. They need to execute. The young ones, they should do a lot of experimentation. That's different. So the accent shifts over time. But what we should not do is celebrate failure. We should celebrate the learning that comes out of the experiments. As an example of one experiment that I have done, my most recent book is called Startup, Scale Up, Screw Up, where I explain this business lifecycle model and much more. I came up with the title. I thought it was fun. And then the publisher said to me, it ends with a bad word, screw up. Maybe we can make it Startup, Screw Up, Scale Up. Put that bad word in the middle. And I said, that makes no sense. That's sort of, that's ridiculous, considering the model that I describe in my book. You start up, you scale up, and then at some point you screw up. That's the natural life cycle of things. Yeah, but maybe people will not buy a book that ends with a bad word. I said, I don't believe that. People are smart. They know that I'm not going to promise them to kill their business. That's a silly argument. But this went back and forth, opinion versus opinion. I said, you know what, we're going to test it. I have a mailing list. I can send an email to 10,000 people, and I did a split test. I sent half of my audience one version of the book cover. I sent the other half of the audience the other version, and then I asked them, how much do you like it? Do you give your feedback here? And that what I measured was the click-through rate, so I could compare these two audiences. Note that I did not ask people to compare the two book covers. That would be a bad test. Nobody buys a book cover from two versions in a bookstore, picking the best title. That's a silly test. They get only one title, and then you need to measure how many people will pick it up with this title. So that's what the test did. And then it turned out actually my version scored better. So yay, I won that discussion with my publisher, and they caved in because, hey, who can argue with data? So that's the point here. You need to run experiments because ultimately it's about evidence. What can you learn from the actual experiment that you do? Now, Amazon is one example of a company that does lots of experiments. Jeff Bezos said, to invent, you have to experiment. If you know in advance that it's going to work, then it's not an experiment, right? And most organizations, they embrace invention, but they don't want the experiments. They don't like the idea of experiments failing. Well, if you Google a little bit, you'll find dozens of failed Amazon experiments. The list is almost endless. It's same with Google, by the way, and Microsoft and those other big companies. And they don't care because Amazon makes huge amounts of money with Amazon Web Services and Kindle and Prime, etc. So they have some amazing successes. And that's the whole point. You try a lot of things knowing that only a few will be successful, but they will pay for all the others. I read that LinkedIn runs about 35,000 concurrent split tests at the same time on their platform. We don't see it. We just get just one version of a web page, but we are guinea pigs while we are using their platform, and they are measuring what our response rates are given the positioning of buttons and the specific texts, etc. Booking.com, a Dutch company based in Amsterdam, I've been there, they do the same. They say about 10% of experiments are actually positive. The rest leads to nothing. They're negative or neutral. At Microsoft, they said about 1/3 of their tests are positive, and the other 2/3 they can throw away. They do not lead to improvement. So whether it's 10% or 33%, doesn't matter that much. The success rates are low of experiments in general for every successful experiment that you do, 3 to 10 will probably fail. That is normal. And that is also scary for some people. Imagine that you need to try 10 things and maybe 1, 2, or 3 of those things that you tried will lead to success. And the rest is all seems to be a waste of your time. So this fear of failure mindset is something that we need to break through. And I think we need to actually stop talking about failure, because with best intentions, I see people in the Agile community keep using that fail word, like celebrate failure, embrace failure, etc., learning from failure. But what you're doing is you keep using that word fail, and people are allergic to it. So it reminds me of that famous example of Richard Nixon last century. He was that failed president. He at some point he said, "I am not a crook." Well, guess what? From that moment, people associated him with the word crook, because he said crook. What he said was, "I am not a crook," but the word "not" was forgotten. They associated him with crook, and he couldn't get rid of that brand anymore, basically. So I think it's a little bit the same with failing, perhaps. So what we need to do is have many small experiments. That's less risky actually than having few big experiments. We need to balance our experiment portfolio, exactly what investors also do. They invest in 20 different startups in a startup batch, an incubator or accelerator, knowing that only 2 or 3 of them will be successful, and the rest they go bankrupt or they are barely profitable. And they don't care, because they know statistics tell them that the 3 good ones, they will pay for all the others. It's exactly the same principle. Investors know how this works in a portfolio. So in a control environment, we need to run experiments, and here you see one of those other terms, safe to fail. Well, maybe we should rename that, like safe to experiment, perhaps, or something like that, because we need to get rid of the word fail. At Spotify, they use the term limited blast radius. I like that one. They say that whenever something blows up, the effect should be small. It should not have a lot of consequences in the architecture of their product, etc. So it's a nice term. And actually, there's another one that I learned just this week that might be even better than the word experiment, which is bet. Someone said, and in a very convincing article, that even with the word experiment, executive teams have problem with that word, because experiments, they do that in science labs, etc. We're not a science lab. We have to make money. So the word experiment may still not work with executive teams. And he said, I get much better response when I talk about bets. All investors know about bets. That's what they do when they have a startup portfolio. They are 20 bets, and they know that 3 of them, maybe 2 or 3, are going to be winners, and the rest they will have to write off. Executives have a much better appreciation for the word bet than for the word experiment. So maybe we need to use that word. We say, hey, we have some assumptions, some hypotheses. We're willing to make a bet on this idea, on this product, on these features, but we're going to see through small features, small feedback cycles, whether the bet turns out to be positive or negative. And then maybe you get a much better response from higher management. In either case, opinions don't count. The opinion of my publisher didn't count. My opinion didn't count. In God we trust. Everyone else has to bring data. I love that. Love that expression. Strong opinions weakly held is another one that I like to use. I have strong opinions, as some people may have noticed on social media, for example, but they are weakly held in the face of evidence. If you show me evidence, all right, my opinion can sway like a leaf on a tree, as I say. So make sure that opinions are backed up by data. So that was the second part. And when we have experiments and learning, we need to measure how to make progress with our teams. I want to share a couple of thoughts on that topic as well. I'd like to begin with this example. Maybe some of you have seen it on the news a couple of years ago. The Wells Fargo scandal was account fraud at this American bank. What happened was that people were incentivized to sell as many products as possible to customers, with the assumption that when customers buy more products, bank accounts, credit cards, loans, whatever, then they probably happier about the bank. So that was incentivized. People got bonuses depending on how many products were sold. Well, guess what happened? Customers ended up with products that they had never ordered. They ended up with 4, 5, 6 credit cards that they had never seen before, because employees secretly gave credit cards to customers to crank up their bonus, trying to make sure that the customers themselves never saw those products, but it did count in the internal systems. Well, of course, this couldn't be kept secret for a long time. At some point, it all came out, and that was a big PR disaster for Wells Fargo. Be careful of what you optimize. This is just one of countless of examples of metrics going wrong. And oops, I see that there are 2 slides in the wrong order. This one belongs to the previous topic. Celebrate learning. Explore, cheap, safe, and fast is how I often refer to experiment these days. But anyways, getting back to the metrics, what gets measured gets managed is something that supposedly Peter Drucker has said. You find that often in management literature. Well, it turns out he never said this. This is a misquotation if you dig a little bit deeper. The actual quote is from someone else, from V.F. Ridgway, I believe a statistician that nobody had ever heard of. And what he actually said was, what gets measured gets managed, even when it is pointless to measure and manage it, and even if it harms the purpose of the organization to do so. So actually, he wrote a warning against measuring things. Be very careful of what you measure, because if it's the wrong thing and people start optimizing it, you get what you ask for. So that thing will go up. The number of products sold to customers will go up. Doesn't mean that customers are happy because something else is actually going on. And W. Edwards Deming has said, and this is supposedly a true quote, whenever there is fear, you will get wrong figures. So when people fear that they are missing out on bonuses, when they might get punished, whatever, they will make sure that the metrics are going in the right direction. People are always smarter than the system, whatever metrics system you come up with, as they always say. Now, I find it important to dig a little bit deeper in the kinds of metrics that we have, because I think there's a bit of confusion around this. I found in general that the experts categorize 4 types of metrics: productivity, output, outcome, and impact. But sometimes these are confused or mistaken for each other. So to give you an example, productivity metrics just tell us how busy we are, like work in progress or queue size. The output is what comes out of the process, velocity, throughput. You can only measure it when you have finished something and you're ready to deliver it. Then what comes later is the outcome, which is what is the result for the customer there. A net promoter score, a fit for purpose. Others are examples. And then finally, hopefully, the happy customers, if they are happy, they will result in a positive impact on your business, which would be revenue, profits, conversion rates, whatnot. Now, logically, there is a sequence here, a sequence in time. The impact metrics clearly you get those much later than the productivity metrics. So the impact metrics are lagging compared to productivity metrics, which then are leading. But this is a relative concept, leading versus lagging. Take Net Promoter Score, for example. That is an outcome metric. What is the outcome for a customer? Are they happy? Well, NPS is lagging when you compare it to velocity. You will know velocity earlier than you know Net Promoter Score. But Net Promoter Score is leading when you compare it to revenue, because probably revenue comes later in many business models. It depends a bit on the kind of business model you have. Some require payment up front, but most of the time it's afterwards. So it's a relative concept, leading versus lagging. That's, I think, an important thing to understand. And to offer you a couple of examples, queue size and wait time on Kanban boards, fine examples of productivity metrics. And lead time and cycle time, great examples of output metrics. You only know those when you have finished something, then you know how long it took. Fitness for purpose, which is from the Kanban method, David Anderson promotes it. Another one, customer effort score, which is newer than Net Promoter Score, is typically something you measure about the customer. So that is the outcome, the effect that the product has on them. And then finally, the most important metrics for the business at the end ultimately are customer lifetime value, CLV it is sometimes called, or monthly active users, or monthly recurring revenue. That's the kind of stuff investors want to see. Those are the numbers that the executives want to steer for. But, and that's something that I have learned, is you need them all, because you cannot steer your organization just on the impact metrics. You get them far too late. By the time you know monthly recurring revenue, lots of things have already happened. So you need to connect those with each other and then say, okay, what outcome metrics and what before that, what output metrics would likely lead to high monthly recurring revenue, because we know the output metrics earlier, they are leading compared to the impact metrics. And that makes it confusing for people, because in some cases, people then only focus on the leading metrics, like, yay, we have great velocity, or yay, we have great throughput. But does that mean ultimately that your customer is going to be happier? You need to see the connection there between the output, the outcome, and at the end, the impact. It needs to make sense. So you need to measure stuff earlier. That means leading indicators, but don't forget that ultimately it's about the impact on the business. I mean, happy customers means nothing when nobody is prepared to pay, right? So ultimately, you need a profitable business. Now, last 5 minutes, I want to wrap up with the innovation funnel, the concept of business lifecycle stages comes back here. And I have been part of an innovation steering committee in the past. That was maybe one of my least successful practices that I participated in. It was basically me and a couple of others, the CTO and the chief marketing officer, judging ideas that were submitted through an idea box, and then deciding whether or not those ideas made sense as new products for new product development. Well, that doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. And this is explained nicely with this video by Robert Cooper. Let me show you for a moment.
The first thing to remember is it's a bit like playing poker. When you sit down at the poker table and you start betting, you don't put all your money on the table. You put maybe $2 or €2, and you get a few cards. And then you bet a little bit more money. You get a few more cards and more information. In other words, new product projects, you never bet all the money at the beginning. It's a stepwise process. It's an incremental commitment. As you learn more, you bet more.
You see, that's interesting. He also uses the word bet, which is smart. He says, new product development, you never bet all the money in the beginning. Only idiots do that. That's not what he said. That's my interpretation here. And I was an idiot because I was part of an innovation committee who was trying to bet out of all the ideas in the idea box, which would be the winning idea. And Robert Cooper says, nobody plays games like that. Nobody plays poker like that because you don't have information. You need information of all the ideas. Let all those startups begin. That's what they do in an accelerator. You give money to 20 different ideas, and then 3 of them will be successful. So innovation is not a tunnel, it is a funnel. It is lots of ideas coming in and only a few coming out. You can draw it like this. It's a bit like Game of Thrones, I sometimes say. First season, lots of families competing for the Iron Throne, but then season by season, more and more are killed off until a couple remain. This is the same principle in many kinds of games and tournaments, basically. It is a proven concept. It is a risk management strategy. In the beginning, you do not have enough.
It sounded like 2 3-year-olds who've got flu trying to sing.
Well, that's another example of a funnel. In this case, X Factor or whatever your favorite program is there. They start with lots of candidates, but they need to make sure that only a few, in some cases only one, remains at the end of the funnel. So what do? They have stages. And per stage, they decide which can go to the next stage and which are out. And they do that based on real evidence of demos, of being on stage, not with business plans or whatever. That doesn't work. So ultimately, we get this kind of picture. I have the 10 stages drawn here like a game, basically, from the bottom to the top. Lots of ideas from idea boxes, maybe from exploration days, from hackathons. They should be able to start in the very first stage, and maybe you give them a very, very small amount of money, as Robert Cooper said in that fragment. You give them one euro, virtually speaking. At Adobe, they do this. They give them all not more than $1,000, and then they need to run tests with $1,000. See if they can get problem solution fit evidence with just $1,000. Maybe you can do something on Kickstarter or something. And then stage by stage, more and more drop out because they are unable to get evidence of their ideas working. But the further they get, the bigger the budgets will be. This is also how it works in the startup scene. Fewer and fewer are remaining, but from angel investors, you go to venture capitalists, and then you go to institutional investors, and the budgets multiply by 10 each time because all the crap ones have disappeared. They have been filtered out of the process. This is how an organization can be agile eternally, because all these different business units with their own products, they should be managed differently depending where they are. The kids need to be treated as kids. The adults they deserve respect, those in stages 7 and 8, because they make money for everyone. They pay for the whole family, including all the kids who are experimenting. So if you come in as an agile coach consultant, you need to be respectful of the ones who are making all the money. And they are also paying you, by the way, as a coach consultant, right? So of course, their agile transformation in stage 7 and 8 is necessary, but they are mainly focusing on execution in those stages with those business units. And you need to understand that your approach for the kids in the innovation funnel at those first 5 stages will have to be different, probably, with different practices. Maybe you teach them the North Star, while the adults are going to be taught OKRs. Think about these differences. And the elderly, the senior citizens in the family, stage 9 and 10, how about just being respectful for how much they have already achieved for the family? I am not trying to change my father anymore. That's no use. I just love him for the person that he has become, and celebrate his 75th birthday in a month or two. And I'm not going to try and change him unless he wants that himself. But he has done his part for the family. It should be the same for the products that are near the end of their life cycle. Just don't bother them anymore. Just help them with a smooth end of life cycle. And then if you manage it like this, you have embraced evolution. The company could exist for a very, very long time, like a species consisting of individual organisms that are born, grow up, and die, start up, scale up, screw up in a never-ending cycle. So my final message is the only way not to be disrupted by other people and other companies is to do this disruption yourself. And that is exactly what companies such as Apple and Google try to do continuously, replacing their existing products with new ones. So thank you so much for listening. I have a final link for those who find this interesting and want to have a few downloads, some background materials. Feel free to go to shiftup.org/join. And it is back to the organizers to see maybe we have 2 or 3 minutes for questions.